In society, we tend to put the idea of a mother's love on a pedestal. We assume that all mothers love their children, that all mothers want their children, and that all mothers can care for their children better than anyone else. And we don't just assume. We expect it. Demand it even. And maybe that's why we fail to acknowledge a startling fact. That sometimes, even the most loving mother can be corrupted by something outside of their control. And it can make them do very bad things. My name is Brienne, and I'm the host and creator of Among the Dirt and Trees, a show where we explore true crime cases that occur out in nature. In today's episode, we're going to discuss a crime that's a little more sensitive than most. It is the story about a woman named Ebony Wilkerson, a pregnant mother that drove her children in their car into the ocean. At the end of the story, everyone lives. No one was physically hurt. But that doesn't make it a happy story. And this episode will focus on something that we're just now beginning to talk about: pregnancy and its impact on mental health. And this one's going to come with a confession from yours truly. Ebony Wilkerson was a pregnant mother of 3, soon to be 4, when something began to go wrong. Some of these things can be spoken for, but not all of them, so bear with me while we go through this. What we do know is that Ebony Wilkerson had some concerns about her husband. There were problems with domestic violence, and Ebony became convinced that her husband intended to hurt her children. As far as I can tell based on the available information, this was true and not a part of any of her mental health concerns. At least, I didn't see any later statements that went back on it. Fearing for herself and her children, Ebony did what plenty of women in her situation have done. She put her kids in the car and went to stay with her sister, hoping to find sanctuary there. It was a sensible decision, but when she arrived in Florida, her sister became worried. Ebony seemed convinced that something bigger was happening. She rambled about Jesus and kept saying that there were demons in her house. If you listen to my last episode, we talked about psychosis and how common it is for psychotic episodes to have religious tones to them. Ebony's sister was worried. This didn't seem like the Ebony that they knew. She sensed that something was wrong, and she believed that she had stopped her sister from leaving. But when Ebony's sister called 911 to ask for help, Ebony found a way to leave, and she took the kids. A short while later, police managed to find Ebony and the children. They talked to her, and she explained her concerns about her husband. The kids seemed fine and happy, and the police felt that they understood the situation. One officer believed that they might have a mental health issue on their hands, but they didn't act on it. Instead, they let her go because they knew that she was not exhibiting the right markers to be held under Florida law. Less than 2 hours passed, and Ebony made a decision. She decided to drive her minivan and her children into the Atlantic Ocean. Ebony said that the Holy Spirit was guiding her, that angels surrounded her as she drove in, and that she believed that her children were perfectly safe. As outsiders, we know this isn't true. This was all happening in her head. And Ebony got very lucky that day. There are a lot of stories like this, and they have some truly awful endings. Fortunately, this isn't one of those stories. On this day, there were people nearby. They watched her drive into the water. They heard the screams of her children and could see the panic that was happening in the car. And they decided to help. Inside the car, there was a wild scene. One child was trying to stop Ebony from driving into the water as they entered the shallows. Ages 3, 9, and 10, there was no way for these kids to fully understand the situation. But these strangers were there. They saw Ebony and they described her as looking possessed. And they got 2 of the children out, the 2 older ones. The third child, a 3-year-old girl, was rescued by a lifeguard who dove in through a front window to rescue her and managed to unhook her. The children made it out alive, and Ebony remained in her daze until she was arrested. So, there's a lot to unpack there, obviously. Pregnancy is no joke. The chemical changes that occur in the human body during pregnancy are absolutely wild. We might laugh about pregnancy cravings and make remarks about a pregnant woman's rage, but do you ever wonder why this happens? During pregnancy, women experience a sudden and very extreme increase in both estrogen and progesterone. These hormones exist in the body at different levels, but during pregnancy, everything kind of goes wild, and it can even change from one person to the next. In this case, Ebony's pregnancy dropped her into a state of psychosis, and she isn't the only one that this has happened to. Pregnant women and new mothers alike experience extreme hormonal changes that influence the entire way that their minds can work sometimes. And sometimes that can be really dangerous. If anything, Ebony is kind of unique because this psychosis occurred during her pregnancy and not after. Postpartum depression affects an estimated 80% of women to some extent. Yes, up to 80% of women get what we know as the baby blues, and a lot of these women experience more extreme versions. Ebony isn't the first woman to have lost touch with reality under the influence of hormones, and the public kind of underestimates how big of an impact hormones can have, but scientists don't. We know that hormones play such a big role that until recently, there was a shared scientific belief that Jacob's syndrome, a condition where people of the male sex have an extra Y chromosome, were considered to be predisposed to violence and aggression because people thought that they were producing more testosterone. When I was in school, I took this as pure scientific fact because it does kind of line up with what we know, and it was the general belief, but recent studies show this actually isn't true at all. The point is that we know hormones influence human behavior, and top scientists take this so seriously that even they can be misled. After everything happened with this case, obviously Ebony was arrested. She was held on 3 counts of aggravated child abuse in addition to first-degree murder charges. Those are some very serious crimes, but this case isn't that simple, right? We know from Ebony's family and subsequent analysis that Ebony wasn't quite herself that day. She was experiencing a psychotic episode, and that came to light fairly quickly. Instead of going to prison alone where she would not receive help, she was forced into hospitalization for several years. Ebony sought treatment and managed to make a complete turnaround. But as a part of her court case, her legal team made an interesting offer. They offered for Ebony to receive tubal ligation to ensure the safety of everyone. Now, a tubal ligation is what people mean when they say getting the tubes tied, and it's a way to ensure that you cannot have children. In this case, since pregnancy influenced her behavior, their thought process was to ensure that she could not get pregnant again, so there was no risk at all. From what I can tell, Ebony decided that this would be what was best. And if that is true, and this wasn't a scheme cooked up by lawyers, I can definitely see where she's coming from. And I do, because it's a procedure that I want to get myself and fully intend to. Now, obviously, my circumstances are very different. I've just known since I was a kid that I never want to have children. It's nothing against kids. It's nothing against motherhood. Right now, one of my best friends is expecting her first child, and I freeze like once a day out of just pure happiness for her, because I know that it's what she wants. But I know, and I have always known, that I never want to have children. There are plenty of life experiences that I want, and parenthood just isn't one of them. I know a lot of people won't get that, and that's fine. I don't expect you to. But what I will say is that I hope you know how difficult it is to make that decision in today's world. And I thought it was a very interesting development for this case. It's obviously not something that gets offered up frequently in a court case, right? Realistically, I could get a new butt and pair of boobs without anyone batting an eye. But being under 35 and trying to convince someone that you want permanent birth control? Well, let's just say that I wouldn't be surprised if Ebony received some pushback despite having 4 kids and a legal reason to make the call. Despite all this, for once, I am happy to share some good news at the end of an episode. After receiving treatment, Ebony was able to reunite with her kids and move on with her life. From what I could find, she is doing much better, and I'm really happy for her. This was a terrible trauma and a tragedy, and it could have ended horribly, but in the end, the right people were there. If there is any word of advice that I can give, it is definitely to make the call if you're worried about someone. Mental health is no joke, and even though her efforts didn't work out, Ebony's sister made a life-saving decision when she recognized that something was wrong. Be that person. It's better for everyone, and it really can save lives. It isn't often that I get to cover crimes that have such a positive ending, so here is your reminder that the basis of solving crime is rehabilitation, no matter what that looks like. Could be prison, could be hospitals. It varies. So, if you want to discuss supporting family, mental health in pregnancy, or child-free living, feel free to contact me on Twitter or Instagram using the tag @datpod. Thanks, guys.